Good morning, everyone. It's quite an honor to have been asked from this great group of international scientists working in equine reproduction to have been asked to join you this morning. So I want you to know I'm very happy to be here. And this is not the title that you were given, but it's the title that I gave the organizers. And over the months, I kept seeing drafts of the program with my title changed. And I would check with them, and they no, well, the reason was they were afraid that people wouldn't come because they wouldn't understand the word ethology, was what I was told. How many people here know the word ethology? Have ever heard of it? A few? Okay, they were right. So I started out my career straight out of a behavioral physiology-based PhD program, and shortly after had the good fortune to be funded by the National Institutes of Health to use the stallion as a model of sexual dysfunction with particular application to humans. And through that, we basically went at that with various pharmacologic probes, and along the way, we found some useful tools to work with stallions with arousal and response problems and specific erection and ejaculation problems. And now, after 30 years or more, 35 years, working in this field, working clinically with stallions, it's so obvious to me that while we have those tools in the toolbox, the most efficient way to overcome many of these problems is to go back to what I learned in undergraduate school, which was animal behavior and understanding how these animals evolved and what pushes their buttons makes them work. So that's when I was given 40 minutes to talk to you about stallion behavior. I thought this would be the most important topic. So let's go. So just a little reminder then, since we all don't know these terms so well, there's two basic branches of the study of animal behavior. One is called ethology, and the other animal behavior. And they're almost synonymous terms, but academically there's a bit of a difference. Ethology grew out of the European school of ethology, and it focused mostly on describing natural behavior under natural conditions. And there are ethologists working today, both basic, still studying what their basic behavioral repertoire is. There's all sorts of categories of discussion in ethology, from mate selection to parenting, all sorts of, and comparative ethologists look along the evolutionary scale, and great discussions about how these things, and now with the onset of the study of genetics, there's just growing interest in that. But applied ethologists also apply that information, for example, working with conservation groups and zoos, that sort of thing. Now, animal behavior grew up in North America primarily, and this was the group of people who wanted to understand how to control behavior, how to, these would be educational psychologists, developmental psychologists, how to best understand the controls of behavior. So B.F. Skinner and all of those folks. I was trained originally in basic and applied animal behavior in a human psychology model. So some of my first exercises were working with disabled children and teaching them very basic skills, training them basically in a Skinnerian behavior modification. So coming into the stallion world, it took me many years before I realized how valuable this information was. So what I'd like to talk about is two fundamental ethological concepts that are relevant to equine reproduction and to the work that I do every day. And I want to give it in context of the example of the slow, shy, or inconsistent breeding stallion. Have any of you ever interacted with a slow, shy, or inconsistent stallion? I'm seeing some nods. It's probably the most common clinical case presentation we have. So, concept one, ethologists will look at a particular species and try to fit it into one of a number of categories and of overall existence and how that affects the behavior. So you'll hear behaviorists say that horses are open plains, grazing, prey, herd species. You'll see this in the popular magazines discussing these aspects of the horse, but that carries with it some characteristics that are common to all of the open plains grazing species. They have vigilant attention to the environment and any potential threats and predators. They have recognition and almost reflexive response to the emotional states of all the organisms around them. So either positive or minus signs of anxiety, fear, alarm, or impending aggression. So they're taking advantage of everything in their environment, birds, other small mammals, to give them either a warning sign or, more importantly, is an ongoing relaxation, or what's called in ethology a safety signal. So if you hear everybody else munching away, grazing comfortably, that's in a way telling you everything is okay. And if that stops, and if you've watched horses when there is a mild alarm, the first thing they do is stop chewing, and that seems to be a socially facilitated safety signal. Activities that distract or momentarily incapacitate are typically brief and quietly inconspicuous. So for example, parturition, breeding. Breeding is very quick. How long does it take a horse to breed? From mounting to dismounting? Anyone? On average, 32 seconds. And also parturition, we know, is very quick in these species. Another characteristic is stoicism, that in the face of threat, any signs of discomfort are especially inconspicuous. So they can be scared, very scared, but we as humans don't recognize that, and that's because their signs are very subtle. Those that have had subtle signs have lived to reproduce. So, the harem breeding, our horses are harem breeding equids. The harem stallion is the main defense and the first to become alert to any threats, and most of his, particularly during the breeding and foaling season, most of his behavior is devoted to vigilance and band defense and to tending mares. Whenever a mare is attractive, sexually attractive, coming into estrus, they have this long lead up to ovulation. The stallion will do what is called tending, which is staying 1 to 2 strides behind the mare and paying attention to every move, any eliminations, any urinations or defecations, he'll cover them. So that's his main job. And he will spend about 50 to 60% of his time budget tending mares when they're in estrus. An interesting concept in ethology is mate selection, both in the long term and in the moment. And as far as we can tell from observations of behavior, it's the mare who makes the decision that it is the moment that breeding will occur. So the stallion is tending. He's not, there's some variation under natural conditions in the forward pestering by the males, but in general, they're just very quiet, biding their time, and it's the mare who makes the invitational gesture. That invitational gesture was identified in the early 70s by a behaviorist who was working in the famous reproduction lab of Ollie Ginther. And the invitational gesture for a mare is a sudden, quick step forward and a stop, turn her head back, and lift one forelimb. And that actually is the universal mating invitation among quadrupeds. The turning of the head back and lifting the leg is a symbol to the male that she's not going to run away and is ready. Another ethology term that you'll hear is sign stimulus, and that turning the head back and flexing forward, you can actually show a stallion a cartoon of a mare in that posture, and many of them will respond instantly sexually just to the cartoon. So this sign stimulus terminology came out of the famous work of Timbergen, who looked at sign stimuli in birds. There's also a term in ethology called fixed action pattern, and that is refers to once something is triggered, that it just proceeds without interruption, and that if you can hit those triggers. And so I'm going to give you some examples of how we can do that when we have a slow stallion try to trigger those fixed action patterns where they'll just go forward not even knowing what they're doing, they're just automatic. Now, we said that breeding is quiet and inconspicuous and brief, and that's true for harem stallions, but it's particularly true for the non-harem stallions that gain access to breeding, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. The other thing that's very interesting, these are photographs from our semi-feral herd that we've had since 1994, sort of a living laboratory for looking at these things. And this is a small new harem, but often the other animals in the band actually crowd around. And so if we're having students going out to record breedings, we have to make them put away their cell phones and make sure that they keep their eyes on the stallion all the time, because very often these things are so quiet, so brief, that they'll be missed. Now, the other concept I want to introduce is one from ethology called alternate breeding strategies. Now, every species that studies, you can identify what is the principal mating strategy. And in other words, how males gain access to breeding. So, of course, polygamy, there's various different categories, perennial pair bonding, harem formation and maintenance, which is our equids, territory maintenance, I should say, which is our horses, donkeys, on the other hand, and all of the asses, their mating strategy is maintaining a territory, and their behavior is very different as a result of it. For those of you who've worked with donkeys, you know that. And of course, seasonal rut or opportunistic breeding. And we think of horses as harem breeders, and we forget that they have an alternate breeding strategy. Every species does. They usually have one or more alternate strategies, and they're often condition dependent, very plastic within a particular group of animals and individuals over time. So while most males, we think of stallions, we think of them as harem breeders. In fact, a good percentage of the foals are sired by an alternate breeding strategy. So, the alternate breeding strategy that you see most often in horses is what's called the sneaky breeder. If you look it up on Wikipedia, you might find it under sneaker breeder or mating or copulation instead of the word breeding. But you can read, and actually Wikipedia is pretty good at definitions of these and examples of these things. But this strategy is used by the young males who it's typically for breeding the young females. The young females in most populations are still in their natal band when they mature. There's an incest avoidance mechanism. Sires are not attracted to their fillies when they're still in the natal band. In fact, when they come into their first estrus, the stallion no longer protects them. Whenever they're in estrus, he just releases them to go out and find a suitable unrelated mate. Now, I said these are studied in all species. If you really get into this, this is the golden oldie textbook on it called Producers and Scroungers, but it will tell you in all different species all about the sneak breeding strategies. Now, what's characteristic of the sneaky breeder? They do interesting things. They morphologically disguise themselves. So in the case of the stallion, the sneaky breeder approaches in a very submissive, almost feminine, juvenile approach. They also sometimes attach themselves in a assistant role or a lieutenant harem stallion role, where they help with the job. They relieve the harem stallion of some of his duties, one of which is looking after the young and playing with the young and being the first line of defense when there's a threat. This is a little cartoon from probably 30 years ago of the basic social organization for the harem breeders. And these solid circles represent harem stallions, mares with their immature offspring, and bachelors, the stallions who do not, the mature stallions who no longer in their natal band and they do not have their own established harem, travel together in a very tightly bonded social group, and they're more or less the army. They're the first to defend the entire band, and so there's a very strong relationship, sort of a love-hate relationship between the harem stallions and the bachelor stallions. But when these fillies mature and go into estrus and are released for the duration of estrus to wander about, these bachelors will come in and try to breed them. The fillies will often still be fairly close to the natal band, and so these guys have to kind of sneak in and not upset the harem stallion. So their juvenile and female postures and behaviors include a quiet approach, no stallion-like vocalization or posture. They definitely don't want to call attention to themselves. A tendency to alternate sexual focus with really interesting behaviors like that baby champing, that submissive behavior. They'll approach the mare and play with the mare and play in the, my stallion handler of many years calls it flossing their teeth on the tail hairs of the mare. And they'll alternate between sexual arousal and play aggression. They appear anxious, and they have what psychologists and physiologic behaviorists would call apprehensive approach avoidance behavior. So you can see them, their sympathetic, parasympathetic tone or balance going back and forth. You see signs of they'll all of a sudden get very itchy, they lick their lips and chew, all of those signs of fluctuating sympathetic tone that tells you that they are quite anxious about the whole deal. Also yawning and auto-grooming. If you've worked with one of these stallions in the breeding shed, you'll know that the stallion handlers often are really frustrated when a stallion is standing behind a mare that he should breed and he starts to yawn, or he'll start to groom excessively, and what that is just going up and down in sympathetic tone. They bide their time. They take a long time, appearing very cautious, and like I said, going back and forth between play behavior and breeding behavior. And they wait until everything is right. The observations under field conditions, at least in our semi-feral herd where we have good access to those observations, is that they usually only breed once or twice and usually on the day of ovulation. So They spend a lot of time invested in the opportunity, and they're not going to put themselves at risk until it'll likely bear fruit. They may quietly achieve erection at a distance, and this is one thing that they're a little bit like jacks, like donkeys. They'll get their erection at a distance and then walk up quietly and breed very quickly and quietly and retreat. So, some of you may have heard of some of these famous snake breeders. These two are actually very interesting. They're both trained by the same trainer. They both won 2 legs of the Triple Crown. And they both turned up to be poster children for snake breeder. On your left is War Emblem. This is a photograph taken at Shad-Eye, and they're very happy for us to talk about the War Emblem story. He had gone to Shad-Eye in Japan right after he lost the race at Belmont, and his first year he could have had the opportunity to breed hundreds of mares. He was shown hundreds of mares. He only bred 6 of those mares, and it was very disappointing. They had tried all different strategies to get him going. He started to get very aggressive, and they essentially gave up for the next year. All of those mares, those 6 mares that were bred, he bred them within 35 seconds from first seeing them. They all got pregnant, and they all foaled. And a couple years later, they all started winning stakes races. So Lloyd's of London, who had paid off on him, were interested again to get him going, but he was a classic snake breeder. On the right is Real Quiet, who is another Bob Baffert trained 2 legs of the Triple Crown. And I met him when he was in Pennsylvania sometime after he had started breeding, but he also was a snake breeder. Now this was the clinical picture for these horses. Quiet, easily distracted, playful juvenile aggression with the handler. And unfortunately, the juvenile aggression, the nipping and whatever, if the stallion handler wants to play that game, these stallions will accelerate the aggression and actually become dangerously aggressive. Very anxious around other stallions. They showed this approach avoidance conflict state, which is momentary sexual interest interrupted by nervous defecation. That's a real signal of a snake breeder. Harem-type breeding stallions rarely defecate in the breeding shed, but these guys will defecate, and that's a sign, again, of nervousness. Also yawning and scratching. And they get frustrated if you force them to do more than they're ready for. They're trying to bide their time, waiting for everything to be right. If you really push them, they will sometimes have what's called displaced aggression on the handler, where they'll just lose it and go after the handler, or sort of that woodpecker dart at the mare. And War Emblem was, when I met him, was doing that. And they occasionally breed very efficiently. Our general recommendations for these stallions to help them get going is to house them away from other stallions. They're intimidated by the other stallions. Try to get them to be able, they can morph into a harem-type stallion if they're given exposure to mares and they're away from other stallions, and even more if they're given the opportunity to dominate submissive males. So if you can get them exposed to some geldings or some yearling males, that they can strut around and be the dominant one. Provide opportunity to express dominance over males, house with mares to be bred, breed away from other stallions and breeding areas. We've had snake breeders that would be fine if they could breed about a half a mile away from any other stallions, and as soon as you would try to put them back into a breeding shed where other stallions had bred, they would immediately become very aggressive, more so than they had been before they started to establish their own harem-style breeding. It's good if you can breed in an open area because they've got their eye on any potential threats. So if you can give them a 360-degree view that there's no harem stallion going to sneak up and get them. Another thing that I learned through the War Emblem story, and learned it actually from a groom who, when we were working with that horse, he pulled me aside and said he knew when War Emblem would breed and when he would be more normally excited. And it turns out that it was with only mares that had no cycle manipulation, no luteolus, no prostaglandin, or no ovulation induction agent, which there were very few that were shown to him. And in fact, looking back, the 6 mares that he bred the first year happened to be mares that had had no cycle manipulation. And these stallions can really tell things that we can't. They know when everything is right, when the hormones are all in the right place. And I think while those cycle management tools are very commonplace, they're very helpful to the industry when working with a snake breeder, we need to give them the opportunity to have the mare in absolutely natural condition. Also, au natural, no washing of the perineum to any of those little things can be disturbing to these guys. And it's not like you might have to do this forever, because once they get going and they establish confidence, they usually morph more into a more harem-style attitude. Also, the last thing people want me to ask for when I go to a farm with one of these is, could I have some maiden mares? Because we're all worried that the maidens... But snake breeders under natural conditions breed primarily the young fillies that... this diversity mechanism of the harem stallion releasing those fillies to go out and breed. And those young fillies seem to be particularly attractive to these stallions. Little tips like avoid test mounting by other stallions. Getting these, if I were there by myself and had control of the situation, I can tell you it would take me very little time to get these guys going if I had a good stallion handler. The problem is trying to work through all of the routine that we want to break. I'm not at all worried about the stallion getting hurt, injured. And that's the usual reason people want to do the test mounting. I'd rather let him be comfortable and let the two get along fine and not worry about the test mounting. The stallion handling in these cases is also very critical, and certainly less is more if the stallion handler can sort of be invisible in these situations, but you need excellent, quiet, non-confrontational, both mare and stallion handling, and as little restraint on the mare as possible because you want her to be able to show all the natural ear positions and posture that will be stimulating for one of these stallions. Maintain the stallion's focus on the mare. Avoid the play interaction. So if the stallion, you need to gear up in a way and stand in positions where if he tends to try to nip, that you can just be non-reactive so that behavior will extinguish. Use the least distracting restraint on both the stallion and the mare. Allow and facilitate the mare expression and let her do that posture, turning her head back and lifting her leg. Allow him to stand off at a short distance, not enforce close contact, because that's often when they start to get very nervous because they're not sure they should be there. And also grazing at a short distance, and if you can let the mare graze and let the stallion follow him in that tending behavior. And now, of course, getting back to the title in your program, we actually do it at sometimes go back to these medications that we developed in the early years of working with difficult stallions. Anxiolytics can be very helpful, simple Valium. We sometimes go to trying to boost the testosterone for these males, but it's definitely a double-edged sword because you can often drive more of that playful aggression into frank aggression with these hormonal approach. And it's not that we don't use this in a crisis, but now when I go to farms, I spend very little time up front trying to arrange to have all of these available for use should we get there. Now another really, how's our time, Dixon? Oh, wonderful. So I can tell you a little bit more about how things went with War Emblem. They moved him away from the main stallion facility, emptied out an old quarantine facility and gave him his own harem of mares. And this was before the time that we realized that he responded so much better to uncycle manipulated mares. But very often mares that will show well to another stallion, and this is so frustrating to the farm managers that they'll show perfectly to stallion A, B, C, and D, and you bring a sneak breeder and the mare is not interested. So of course this one's heavily sedated so that she wouldn't send negative signals, but there she is standing, not sending any of the positive signals. And at this point, it was taking sometimes as much as an hour to get going, and sometimes he wouldn't actually get the momentum to mount and breed. So while we were working with him, we had a lot of downtime, and my stallion handler and I were trying to think of ways around this. And one of the things, these stallions are so quiet also that the mature mares don't respond to them very well. They often don't do that. Even when they do mount, they don't give that little nicker warning to the mare that they're going to mount, so you get some problems. So we came up with this crazy applied ethology idea to try to get the vocalization signals to the mare to get her to respond and to trigger that fixed action pattern that gets the stallion to actually mount. So we used a fly mask with blinkers to block any view of the stallion because he's not going to be showing the correct behavior. And then we put wireless earbuds. And we also used preputial wipes from a stallion who was, the mare was very responsive to, so that she could actually we could trick her into thinking this was a harem type stallion. Now, we also, the earbuds were to give her the vocalizations, and we selected a stallion that we owned at the time who was one of our teaching stallions who, there's quite a bit of variation between stallions in how the mares respond to their vocalizations. We had done vocalization studies with folks from Poland many years ago, and so we selected a stallion that was known on the property. He could be just walking, 50 yards from the barn and vocalize, and all the mares would respond. So we carefully selected. And we have 4 different types of vocalizations. So the stallion handler can be handling the mare, and I'm usually operating it from my cell phone to give the appropriate vocalization and to get the mare respond. Let's see if this will play. This voice is amazing. Whenever I play it in the hospital, I have to make sure nobody's in the barn trying to palpate mares because they all immediately respond. And then that nice little close teasing vocalization. Can we go on to the next one? I think I have to play these all the way through. Can you advance it to the next? Okay, so I'll just show you, this is a mare just in a stall. There's no live stallion anywhere. And the first thing you're going to hear is a vocalization. That's her responding to the vocalization. This is a teasing sequence that we have We actually have mares who will not respond to a live stallion. They're also anxious under the circumstances. And if you play this recording, you can actually do good estrus detection. So this is just the earbuds and my cell phone. Okay. Okay, well, that's all I have in slides. I will say this is one of my favorite series of photographs. This is foals that we've watched from birth through 2 months of age and looked at the development of their behavior over that period. The most interesting thing to me is that all foals that we've observed, dozens that we've watched from birth through 2 months of age, within that time, all male foals and all fillies show all elements of both male and female sexual behavior during their play. And so in this particular series, the filly who's turning her head back in the mating invitation, that's actually a colt. And the one who's doing the little teasing gestures is a filly. And there you go. And they switch back and forth in their play behavior. And it's always, I even sit down sometimes at coffee between sessions with stallion managers and handlers and talk to them about them. This guy can do it. I'm sure he did it as a foal. And we'll get him to mount that mare. So, do we have time for questions? If not, Dixon's...